I'm Catherine Mazzone here on behalf of MojoStreaming, and I'm very pleased to welcome our guest, Ross Harvey. He is the Director of Research and Programs at Good Governance Africa. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me, Catherine.
Absolutely. And I just want to start with the basics. What exactly is Good Governance Africa?
Yeah, great question. So we are a non-governmental organization or non-profit organization set up about 10 years ago, really to try and improve governance at a macro political level on the continent. And our basic definition of governance is that it's about who gets what, when, and how. And good governance then obviously is about ensuring the allocation of resources in a way that is transparent, accountable, inclusive, and efficient, and that helps to get broad-based development going, which is really what we would like to see in African contexts. We're concerned that the bottom billion, to use Paul Collier's phrase, largely live in this continent, and given the vast resources that we have, that just shouldn't be the case.
You raise excellent points, and there's obviously a lot for you to tackle just by definition of your job. So what are you all focused on? Lots of research going on in lots of different areas, I'm sure. Are there primary or priorities that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got centres across the continent. Based in Johannesburg, we've got our Southern Africa Development Community Centre, and then we've got a centre in Accra in Ghana, in Lagos in Nigeria, and in Addis in Ethiopia. So in the SADC office, we're predominantly focused on 4 research areas, all very broad: human security and climate change, natural resource governance. Those two are obviously integrally connected, because if we manage our natural resources well, then we hope that we'll be able to truncate the curve. What we mean by that is we'll be able to industrialize in a way that doesn't destroy the environment, but rather is able to increase income per capita in a way that is actually coherent with what new technologies afford us, and doesn't destroy the environment in a way that further exacerbates climate change. So we're focused on adaptation in many respects, but also in whatever way we can to mitigation. And then in the natural resource governance program specifically, we're focused on trying to ensure that our natural resources are not a curse. You'll have heard of this phrase, the resource curse, the paradoxical relationship between resource abundance and underdevelopment. And our view is that with the right institutions in place, with the right kind of economic strategy, our resources should actually contribute to broad-based development rather than to a few elites becoming wealthy. And then we also have a governance delivery and impact program, which is focused at a more macro level on ensuring that elections are free and fair, that participatory governance actually happens, that politics is competitive, that opposition parties are afforded the right to freedom of association and expression. And of course, there we're concerned about democratic backsliding, not just in African contexts, but also across the world. But of course, we see the negative effects of it close to home. So we're working against that. And then finally, we've got a governance insights and analytics program, and that's really our data hub, where we steward what we've called an Africa Digital Data Bank, which is an amalgamation of a whole bunch of different disparate data sets that are kind of merged in a way that makes countries and their data comparable across time and variables. So we've got our work cut out for us. The thing that I should probably mention specifically in the natural resource governance program is that we're not only focused on the mining industry, but we're particularly passionate about ensuring that we conserve our wild spaces in a way that actually really serves people, and also retains some of the world's last wildernesses intact. Ecologically healthy ecosystems are both a form of carbon mitigation and provide avenues for adaptation, and they also provide, in respect of the latter, opportunities for people to actually make a living. And the truth is that in many African contexts, given that we're facing premature deindustrialization, ecotourism actually offers a significant channel through which we can actually provide jobs and potential future livelihoods. You know, mines don't last forever, and if you can, as has been done in one case in Zambia, if you can create potential for tourism after the mine has collapsed or closed rather, then you're on a winning ticket. But we have to think about our development in that kind of way. We really have to be focused on sustainability.
That's really important to our viewers at MojoStreaming. We already have a lot of trophy hunting going on. Would you say that that's one avenue that helps the folks there?
Yeah, Catherine, good question. I'm personally, on the basis of the evidence, opposed to the view that trophy hunting has a reasonable role to play in genuinely sustainable development. I think trophy hunting often gets justified on the pretext that it is a form of sustainable use. And of course, the idea of sustainable use is itself dependent on what environmental economists would call a maximum sustainable yield, where you can extract or harvest an amount from the wild that doesn't jeopardize the stock of that resource in the following year. And the problem, of course, with that view is that one has to have extremely robust scientific data as to exactly what kind of stock is available. You also have to be sure that whatever you remove from that stock will not jeopardize the future health of those populations in question. And thus far, firstly, given poor governance, but also given the lack of real engagement with the science, I see little to no evidence that trophy hunting can actually support a sustainable use pretext. I think that if you look at Botswana in particular, the elephant management plan was put together 2 years after the trophy hunting ban was lifted, and it makes no reference, not one single reference to, firstly, to the wildlife numbers surveys that have been carried out in Botswana by the likes of Elephants Without Borders, and it secondly doesn't make any reference to the science that is pretty unequivocal now, that removing older male bulls from elephant populations in particular is highly destructive, both for elephant populations, but also for ecological integrity. So I think that if you look at the governance and you look at the science, it's very difficult to support a view that trophy hunting plays any reasonable role in sustainable development.
And of course, we've featured a scientist on MojoStreaming for a debate that we had about the question of whether trophy hunting is necessary for conservation. And she was saying that there were studies that were done that indicate that it was beneficial to the people. Is this just outdated information?
Yeah, great question. I think it's probably worth dealing with each kind of premise in turn. One, the idea that trophy hunting resolves the problem of say human and wildlife conflicts, or particularly human and elephant conflicts in this case, doesn't seem to bear up under scrutiny. Most of the studies we have on elephant behavior are unequivocal in the conclusion that older male bulls help to discipline younger bulls and prevent them from becoming delinquents. I'll give you an example. There were elephants culled in the Kruger Park, South African Kruger National Park, in the 90s, with a view to trying to reduce the population on the pretext that it was having a negative impact on the ecology. And I'll come back to that point in a second. But some of the younger bulls that were orphaned from from those culls were then moved to Pilanesberg National Park and proceeded to sexually assault the rhinos. It was only after the introduction of older bulls that kind of behavior stopped. So we have strong evidence there that the likelihood of human and elephant conflict is actually reduced because older bulls transfer knowledge. They also provide a disciplining function. So crop raiding elephants are less likely to interfere where people live if they are disciplined by older bulls. Now, the other thing to say about that is that it seems much more fruitful to me, and the science seems to support this policy intervention much more strongly than hunting, and that is to create safe migratory corridors through which elephants can move, so that they avoid croplands and that farmers avoid planting crops in areas in which elephants are identified to move. And there are conflict mitigating devices that can actually contribute to livelihood production as well. So the production of bees and honey, for instance, are both products that can then be sold into the tourism value chain, provided you create conservation agriculture buffer zones on the borders of protected areas. So there does have to be a holistic plan in place. And that does require buy-in from a lot of stakeholders. I think it's often easier for governments to simply say, well, let's just create theoretical landscape of fear, and elephants will just somehow retreat into places where they have no contact with humans. But the problem with that is, as I say, if you remove the older bulls, which are the bulls that trophy hunters are after, it doesn't seem likely to me that you're going to create the kind of behavior that will reduce human and elephant conflict. The second argument then is that if we remove older bulls, we'll somehow remove the negative impacts of elephants on the landscape. That also misunderstands the science. If you create wild connected spaces for elephants to move in, they actually have what we call a heterogeneous or an uneven impact on the landscape, which is actually regenerative for that landscape. So you'll have a lot of scientists saying, well, we lost all these beautiful trees on the Chobe River. There are too many elephants and we must shoot the elephants. But everyone recognizes, firstly, you're not going to solve any supposed overpopulation problem by shooting a handful of older bull elephants. And what that also misses is that those trees were probably only there because of colonially introduced rinderpest, which is a disease that would have taken out other animals that would have been eating the seeds and the saplings of those trees. So elephants transport seeds up to 90 kilometers away from where they've ingested them, which creates new growth. It also helps to thin out the vegetation, which is carbon positive because it maintains the health of those ecosystems, as I've said. And then thirdly, I think the point to recognize is that older bulls are increasingly reproductively successful. So it's not as if you can remove an older bull on the pretext that, well, they've already passed their genetic material on. It doesn't work like that. The chances of transferring big tusk genes, for instance, are increased through multiple reproductive activity. And so we find actually that older bulls are increasingly reproductively successful until the point where they die, siring the most offspring between age 45, between 40 and 55. So we have to make sure that they actually reach that age. And at the moment, hunting regulations normally allow hunters to shoot bulls over the age of 35. And you'll have seen in Botswana just recently two of the biggest remaining bulls shot with tusk sizes of over 100 pounds in the first instance, and then 90 pounds in the second. And this is a travesty. I mean, we're shooting our own heritage, bulls in their prime. And again, hunters will tell you, no, we only shoot past prime males. That's not true. That just doesn't bear up under scientific scrutiny at all. Sorry, Catherine. Actually, lastly, to your points about the provision of livelihoods and protein to communities, there's some very good material just published in the last couple of weeks in Africa Geographic showing that if you look at what hunters pay versus what the community actually receives, I think you'd have to say that this argument is at best a ruse or a highly condescending patrimonial view of just handing out the most menial of jobs and the provision of some protein to communities in need. That strikes me as exploitation rather than genuinely inclusive development, which the alternative would actually be to include local communities in tourism value chains, which seems to me a lot more sustainable. And again, there are studies showing that over a lifetime, elephants are worth something like 76 times more over a lifespan to tourism than they are to one hunt, where a hunter might pay $80,000 for a bull elephant. That elephant is valuable to photo tourists as well. So the opportunity costs are high.
And we've mainly talked about elephants, but is this a model that can be applied to other animals that are often hunted by trophy hunters?
Yeah, Catherine, I think so. I think if you look, for instance, just at South Africa alone, that lions and leopards have clearly been shot in their prime. Again, hunters are of the view, or certainly justify their activities by saying that they only shoot males that are past their prime breeding age. But when we do actually age the animals, then we see that in fact they're shot below, say, the age of 7 in the case of lions. There was one animal from the Kruger Park that was shot in the Bululi Reserve, which borders the Kruger Park, and that lion was actually clearly in its prime. So again, I think you've got to ask questions about the kind of genuineness with which hunters hold to this argument. Hunters are after a trophy, which means that they're actually after shooting animals in their prime. Otherwise, it defeats the object of obtaining the nicest looking trophy. So I just don't buy the argument that they're in the business of shooting animals past their prime. Plus, we know that our big cats are in even shorter supply than elephants. We've got about 23,000 lions left in the wild, whereas we've probably got about 400,000 elephants. Leopards even less so. And then the final kind of iconic species that's being hunted is white rhino and black rhino. The South African government actually just put out a press release a few weeks ago saying that, well, a few months ago rather, in February, saying we can shoot 10 black rhino, but they actually hadn't gazetted any kind of quota or reference to science supporting that quota. The idea is that black rhinos fight each other on small territory. So if you remove one, then all the better for everyone else, and of course you can make money in the process. Again, there are less than 5,000 black rhinos left in the world. So the idea of shooting one when that rhino could, for instance, be translocated to a reserve that would actually look after them, I just don't buy the arguments again. And there have been successful translocations. Unfortunately, the white rhinos translocated to Botswana have all but been poached out since President Masisi came into power in 2018.
And is poaching something, I mean, you can't ignore it, poaching and trafficking. What role would you say you all play in that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the arguments that's been offered is that hunters will provide anti-poaching presence in areas where photographic tourists are reluctant to go. I think that argument has really been defeated through the unlikelihood of the success of some photographic tourist endeavors. So, for instance, there are a set of salt pans in Botswana, which I think if you looked at first glance wouldn't be your first choice of place to go as a photographic tourist. And yet the marketing has been so successful that photographic tourists have gone there. And in fact, really appreciate the solace and the utter vastness and the desolation of the environment. So the idea that hunters tread where no photographic tourist will go, that doesn't seem to stand up. Actually, what we do need to do though is create safe corridors and at least put research presence and some kind of anti-poaching presence in areas that are vulnerable and perhaps not yet amenable to photographic tourism. Poaching is a really serious problem. It seems to me, on the basis of the evidence thus far, that given the unknowns, that it's better to have a relatively simple strategy that doesn't rely on too many unprovable hypotheses. So trying to reduce demand in whatever way possible seems an optimal strategy, but of course you're very unlikely to be able to undermine demand if you continue to legitimize supply. So my argument against trade, for instance, of ivory or rhino horn is that for as long as you send a signal to the market that supply is readily available, then why should consumers not purchase ivory or rhino horn? I just don't think that works. I think that sometimes people who propose a legal trade, firstly, are naive about how those legal channels will be used as avenues to launder illicit products. I think that they're also naive about the extent to which that undermines the messaging that says, hey, ivory belongs to elephants and rhino horns belong to rhinos. They are of zero aesthetic or medicinal value. That message has to be supported by supply side substantiation. I think, unfortunately, there are recalcitrant countries like Zimbabwe and Namibia who continue to insist that they would make hundreds of millions of dollars with which they could put money into conservation. The problem is that money could surely just as easily be made through having a proper tourism strategy, but that's hard work, and of course there are no easy rents available to officials who would seek to benefit from allocating trophy hunting licenses and perhaps from allowing trade. What we saw in the wake of the one-off ivory sale in 2008 was a massive poaching spree. Tanzania's Selous National Park, Selous Game Reserve, which is now Nyerere National Park, lost, if I remember correctly, about 70,000 elephants between 2009 and 2014. And there are only about 10,000 left in that reserve now, after having done relatively well up until 2006 or so. I should say, I think that they've lost 60,000 between between 2009 and 2014, and a slow recovery since then. But one-off sales, there's still a lot of statistical debate as to whether that's what caused the poaching, whether it was just purely attributable to a rise in incomes in Southeast Asian markets. But I think you'd be silly to ignore the correlation.
determining what's true and what's not, especially for the sake of these policymakers, it seems to me would be crucial. So how do you focus on something and get it out there to actually influence people by saying, hey, we've studied phototourism and these are the numbers, and we've studied trophy hunting and these are the numbers. Look here.
Yeah, great question, Catherine. Yeah, look, it's a highly contentious space, right? In part because, a little bit like with climate science, you have companies that explicitly set out to deny what the climate research was showing. ExxonMobil, for instance, actively, they supported the research, and then, of course, when the research findings were a big red flag to their business, that they sought to greenwash it. And I think that you've got to understand that the hunting lobby is particularly influential, and they pay. So I think that the research really has to be interrogated on its own merits, and that can be confusing for a lot of people. And there will be views on both sides, because the hard evidence may not be conclusive. But I think what you have to do for policy's sake is say, look, on the basis of the weight of the evidence, given what we know, there are absolute known knowns. We know that it's a bad idea to remove older elephant bulls from the population. We know that there's abuse in the system. We know that it's badly governed. We know that the science supporting quota allocations doesn't exist. And if it does exist, it's not in the public domain. These are good basic governance premises on which to not pursue the policy. So I think that's one way of cutting through the noise around competing arguments. So what do we know? We know that there's no science. You can shoot 5 elephants in Ngamiland 13, which is a little block above the delta, the Okavango Delta. And then you can shoot 20 elephants in another place. And of course, that kind of discrete demarcation is a denial of the science that elephants move, and they cover a lot of distance every day. So there's no thought given to the dynamism and the actual truth, if you like, of how elephants move. So you can interrogate policies that are made on that basis alone, which I think gives one sufficient reason to doubt to doubt the wisdom of the policy that's currently being enacted. It's very difficult to influence policy when the stakes are so high for industry players who would lose out. And those opposing trophy hunting are often kind of simply dismissed as greenies or snowflakes or whatever, who don't want to understand the reality on the ground and so on. I've faced these arguments now for the last 8 years at least. And you have to just keep responding by saying, hey, look at the evidence. What do you have to say about the scientific paper that shows that elephants are increasingly reproductively successful and there's no such thing as a surplus male bull? And if there's no answer to that question, just in the case of elephants alone, then you have to be able to say, it's not because I'm some kind of greenie. Actually, the science is strongly dubious about the wisdom of trophy hunting. That would and you've just got to keep putting information out there. In an age of misinformation, you've got to keep trying to show that your work is evidence-based and supported by the latest rigorous science.
What else haven't I asked you that you think is important?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I suppose that one of the interesting things that's happening at the moment is that, there are moves in the UK, for instance, and in Belgium and even the US to try and ban trophy imports. And of course, trade in ivory and rhino horn has been officially banned at the global level. And efforts like that are often cast by the trophy hunting industry or those with an interest in trade as some kind of neo-colonial imposition. We must let African countries decide for themselves and so on. And I find these arguments deeply disingenuous. Even by those who make them recognize that trophy hunting is a colonial activity, it by definition. Wealthy, largely white foreigners going to African countries and harvesting, extracting natural resources and repatriating those artifacts home and putting them on a wall wherever, in the US or Belgium or the UK. And so this idea that African countries must decide for themselves, etc., it's just, as I say, it's disingenuous. African countries should decide for themselves, and they should decide policies based on future generations' best interests, and that is to have healthy ecological systems with intact wild spaces, with as little human interference as possible, and with as much benefit accruing from the conservation of those spaces to local communities as possible. And that is hard work. It's hard to get people to agree. It's much easier to make money from trophy hunting and then tell anyone who doesn't agree with it that they're being neo-colonial. It's just lazy.
Ross, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Catherine.